People who work in morgues or with the dead. What is the creepiest thing you've witnessed? Sometimes when people have died, and we turn them over to clean and dress them, they still have air in their lungs and will make grunting noises when moved. Scared the crap out of me, the first time I experienced it. My grandpa had a related experience in Vietnam. He was helping wash and prepare bodies for transport home under the direction of the coroner, who had warned them about the bodies making noises when moved. After a bit, Grandpa asked the coroner how the body he was washing could cry. The coroner repeated the lecture about air being pushed out and Grandpa said that he got that part, but how did that form tears? He said things got very busy after that. Grandpa's assigned corpse was not actually dead, just suffering a lot of blood loss and very, very cold. Dude got 5 liters of blood, some of it from my grandpa, and then he flew home to spend the rest of the war recovering. Imagine fucking laying there as somebody prepares you thinking you're a damn corpse. I'd cry too. I gave my husband CPR when he passed away and I swear he said love when the air escaped like he was trying to tell me one last time that he loved me. And I swear he said love then. That is the indisputable truth, and all of us here will vouch for it. Question it no longer. Peace. Honestly, it might really be what happened. When my grandma passed away, she had a stroke that morning and was rushed to the ER and my grandpa went with her. My father lived abroad and I called him to tell him that she had had a stroke and he needed to come ASAP. So my father drove there and when he arrived in the evening, we went together to the hospital. The plan was that he'd take over watching over my grandma and my grandpa who'd been there all day would come back home with me to get some rest. Well, we hadn't even left the hospital grounds yet that my father came running behind us saying she's going, and in that situation you know exactly what this means. Indeed, by the time we walked hurriedly back to her bed, the doctor told us that they wouldn't attempt to resuscitate her as she indeed had passed away. Considering how this happened suddenly, as she'd been in critical but stable state all day, we're certain that in whatever fragment of consciousness she still had, she was holding on so that she could see my father one last time, and once she did, she let herself go. I wouldn't be surprised if in your case, in whatever fragments of consciousness your husband still had, his last words indeed were that he loved you. When I was 13 I volunteered at a sunrise assisted living. I spent a lot of time there, it was better than being home. I would play games and watch movies and just talk to the residents. Ethel and I connected, and even though she was non-verbal from a stroke many years before, we would have fun together. Even if it was just hanging out watching Jeopardy! When she was passing, she wasn't letting go. I got a phone call from her son to come and see her. She passed shortly after I left. They told me she was waiting to say goodbye to me. I'm glad I was able to provide some happiness at the end of her life. My best friend did the wait for everyone to leave thing. Well, me anyway. He slowly passed over a few days, and he would wake up once or twice a day. He would get so upset with himself that he hadn't died yet when he would wake up. He would say, "I can't even do this right." It was very sad, but funny. He would also, every time, say something about me being there and not at work. He was upset about it, like he was going to get me in trouble at work because I took the days off. On the 3rd day I did have to go to work, no choice. I told him and he told me that made him feel better. I drove home, took a shower, and by the time I was putting on my shoes my wife called and said he was gone. He was a proud guy, and I still wonder if he was embarrassed to die with me there, like a dude thing or something. Or it was just strange timing, who knows. When my cousin died, 28, I lived next door to him. So his GF came to my house screaming that he was dead. I was 25 at the time and went into his room and yep, he was dead. I tried CPR just in case while his GF called 911. Now I have never done CPR before on someone, I have only done the regular certification training. So I do a couple rounds of breathing then chest compressions, and suddenly he started groaning. I started crying thinking that somehow I had brought him back. What I was never told in certification was that the air will come back out and make a groaning noise. Yay, it fucked me up for a while as he was my cousin and best friend. And just thinking that somehow I was able to get him back only to lose him again, man, that just got to me. Edit. I just wanted to thank everyone for the kindness that has been shown. To answer a few questions about what happened, he died from a heart attack. When the doctor met with the family at the hospital we were told he had been dead for a while. Luckily he had died in his sleep, so there is at least that. He never messed with hard drugs but did drink heavily. I have had training several times and also knew the chance of survival were low. I guess that is why the groan he gave had me surprised, relived, or whatever you could call it. Over the years I have been trained by different people. None of them mentioned that you could force air out and cause a noise such as a groan. Of course, last time I re-certified I was told to just do compressions. I will say, if available, please take CPR and first aid classes from an instructor. Do this especially if you have small children. My course covered infant choking and how to dislodge the foreign object. It will come in handy. When my first son had something caught in his throat, luckily my wife was there and she was a ex-EMT, so she was able to get it cleared quick. One of the decedent's grandsons faked a breakdown over the casket. He stole all her jewelry. Didn't take long to figure out and a large brawl broke out. Jewelry was retrieved. 2 weeks later, grandson turns up needing to be processed and buried. Creepy as hell. Edit for eating shoots and leaves. IYKYK. I worked at a funeral home for quite a while. When I first started, about a month in, I was working a holiday weekend. Only people working were the transport guys. They came to drop off a body, went right back out. I thought they were still there and needed to ask a question. I walked into the embalming area. This dude was sitting up on the gurney looking right at me when I opened the door, and it literally made me pee a little in fright. Turns out the transport guys picked up the body from an area hospital. He'd passed away while in a slightly reclining position. Rigor had set in. They couldn't flatten him out. Still the scariest moment in my career, even if I got a laugh out of it later. I initiated compressions on my patient when she unexpectedly coded. About halfway through my first round, the patient pinked up, eyes opened, turned her head and groaned. I stopped, and so did she. Turned gray and unresponsive, so I started compressions again. She woke up again, and I realized that compressions were providing adequate perfusion to her brain, so she'd wake up, but her heart wasn't doing anything. I had to continue compressions and shock my patient, who was awake, groaning, and alert enough to know what was happening. I've coded countless patients without a problem, but this event gave me nightmares for some time. I was part of search and rescue for 3 years. I was in the scuba team, so we were responsible for finding the usually dead people at sea. The salt water adds so much horror to a body. Not to mention the fish that usually will start picking on a corpse sooner than later. My creepiest experience was trying to find the body of a Jane Doe was missing. She was a prostitute against her will, brought over by human trafficking. Turns out she slit her wrist parallel to her veins and jumped into this rocky and sharp outcrop into the sea. We went diving in less than ideal conditions. It was low visibility and waves. My scuba buddy and I were looking at an outcrop when suddenly out of the darkest a deep blue hand emerged from this little cavern in the rocks. It began twitching and moving, and as we tried to pull the hand, the rest of the corpse emerged. She was being picked on by Murray eels, hence the twitching, which emerged with bits of human flesh in their mouths. Her mouth was wide open in a scream position and her eyes were gone. You can see tendons and bones in her hands, and the sharp rocks tore her entire body to shreds in various spots. Her toes were mostly gone too, with some bits of bone sticking out. To this day it haunts me. The worst was pulling her out and swimming with the body as eels and fish followed us, occasionally picking on bits of flesh. Obligatory edit to say thanks for awards etc. I will try to respond to all the replies. Edit 2. Changed the term sex worker to clarify that it was against her will, as suggested by some Redditors. Human osteologist here. I work with dry human bones, so they don't do too much. But one of the times I've ever gotten the creeps was when I was handling a crania in the collection and could hear the wisdom teeth shaking around, partially formed but not quite erupted, in the mandible. Wisdom teeth form around 18 years old and erupt generally in late teens or early 20s. I, at the time, was about 20 and my wisdom teeth were just coming through. I realized these remains belonged to a girl about my age. That's probably exactly what my skull looks like. It really humanized things for me. People who had been on blood thinner medication before they died can make for an odd scene. Saw a guy that had died looking out of his window, so he was discovered with his head on the windowsill and there was a thick column of jellied blood from his nose to the floor. It was a bit freaky. Here is a funny story from my grandma. She used to work in an in Puerto Rico. Some guy had passed away, and so the doctor came up to her and asked her to prepare the body to go to the morgue. So, she got some sheets, and started to wrap this guy up. As she crossed his legs, suddenly his penis became fully erect and was straight up. She wasn't sure what to make of it. But, it forced her to have to redo the sheets. So as she uncrossed his legs, the penis went down. So she was like, "All right, let's get this over with." Then she crossed them again, and lo and behold, the penis went straight back up. Tried one more time and then she got freaked out and went back to the doctor. Obviously he found this hilarious as the guy apparently had a prosthetic in his penis. Die Hard. Worked at a mortuary for a few years. We have methods to keep the jaw shut for viewing. Otherwise it would gap open due to the angle of the head and neck. During a viewing the device failed and this gentleman's mouth literally popped open. The lead embalmer was not on site, so I did my best. Ushered the family out of the room and superglued his mouth shut. But he didn't have teeth and supergluing just his lips did not work. It looked as if he was attempting to scream. I had to call in one of our other mortuaries in town, and that embalmer used a giant needle and thread to sew his mouth shut from under his chin to his palate. Yes. It is a huge undertaking. Not necessarily the creepiest thing, but the funeral home I worked for liked to embalm as soon as possible after death. I had embalmed a man that was dead for less than 30 minutes an hour. He was still warm and rigor had not set in yet. I kinda just held his hand for a minute before I got started. Edit. Wow, I'm really happy this comment blew up. It really shows that compassion isn't dead. Thank you. When my wife passed away suddenly, I was sitting with her in the and when I came back in, they had her swaddled, like an infant. I managed to get her hand out, and was holding her hand thinking taut as long as I was holding it, it wouldn't get cold. You have smelt nothing until you have smelt the farts of the dead. Former CEBT. My wife is a mortician. She's had quite a lot of wacky experiences. This is more funny than creepy, but once she was trying to break up the rigor mortis in a decedent's hip by flexing the entire leg up. Her grip slipped and the leg swung down, the heel cracking her right in the face, resulting in a black eye. She had to explain to people that she's not in an abusive relationship. She just got kicked in the face by a dead guy. A friend told me this story ages ago, and I hope I remember it well enough. When he was 18, he worked for a single-plane transport contractor, and one time they had to carry a body. It wasn't autopsied or prepared for funeral yet, that was where they were taking it. So it was wrapped and just sort of laying on the floor. Now when you're in the air, I'm sure other pilots will tell you, the rise and fall of the airplane will do strange things with gravity, air pressure, and necromancy. In any case, the corpse had enough air in its lungs that the lower pressure outside the body caused the air inside to be expelled, slowly and through the larynx. Meanwhile, rise and fall of the plane caused the body to sit up and the wrapping to fall away. Sitting up caused it to expel more air from the lungs. So while flying a dead body in the plane, they heard a long low moan, and saw a dead body sit up in the back of the plane. The pilot panicked, left the controls, and ran back and punched the corpse across the face, knocking it back down. He told me about how they figured out what happened, but I was laughing too hard at that point to really pick up the details. I do remember that they had to explain the additional damage to the corpse when they arrived at their destination. Edit. A detail and a spelling. So if the dead guy was coming back, dude's first instinct is to punch him back to the afterlife. Fight or flight instincts, man. Funny that the pilot's instinct wasn't flight. He was already in flight, so fight was the only option left. He was getting paid to transport a dead body. If he arrived with a live one, he'd have hours of paperwork to fill out. Kudos to him for punching the corpse, cuz I would've just jumped out the plane. Lol. Edit. Holy shit, thanks for the award. Sometimes a fresh corpse will get shaky limbs. Make it a bitch to bag up in a hurry. I'm not dead. What? I'm not dead. He says he's not dead. Had a gig doing overnight transport of dead bodies. Think black suit, white shirt, black tie, unmarked black van, and boss made us wear white gloves. He wanted us to look high-end. Needed to transport a recently deceased middle-aged woman, breast cancer, 250 miles in the dead of night from a hospital morgue to a mortuary near her extended family. It's been a solid 2 hours of total silence when the corpse lets out a low wail. Sounds like ooh hoo 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 ha. I about shit myself as I swerve off the freeway and spray out a rooster tail of gravel and dirt. Even though, intellectually, I know this is just stomach gases escaping the body, I couldn't help but be a little freaked out. Attended a suspected fire once where we could smell smoke but couldn't locate the fire. Eventually located it, and when we entered the house there was an old woman slumped over on the floor. Tried to turn her over but couldn't. Turned out that she had been laid on one of the old bar-type heaters, and because the heat was not allowed to escape, it had burnt a hole through the floorboards and the heater fell through the hole. However, when she was laid on it her body fats started to melt and run into the floorboards, then when the heater fell through she cooled. By the time we got there she was one with the floor. 2 of us to get shovels under her to roll her over. It was years before I could eat smoky bacon flavor crisps again. If someone's been down for more than a day or 2, they'll start decomposing from the inside out. If the room is quiet enough, you can hear lots of gurgling and rumbling as the gases and fluids are moving around inside. And then you move them and they groan as the residual air in their lungs is forced out past their vocal cords. Before COVID, I worked at a funeral home that wasn't particularly well run. I was a funeral assistant, and one of the embalmers was notoriously difficult to deal with. Her name was AJ. About 4 days before this story, AJ had picked up a deceased man who had died of septicemia and who was to be cremated due to the fact he was already in a bad state on death. So AJ had the brilliant idea to leave this gentleman on the rolling cot for 4 days unrefrigerated, figuring it wouldn't matter since he was being cremated and it was a slow week. Of course, I got the job of moving him to the crematory with AJ. We walked into the embalming room and found that the decedent had bloated and was leaking a gray liquid sludge out of his urinary catheter onto the floor. If pestilence had a smell, it would have been this liquid. It smelled like a warning to the base lizard part of my brain. To describe this liquid as smelling bad is an understatement. The liquid was something you could feel and sense in the air. AJ and I donned our gear, and luckily since she placed him on a cot already, we didn't have to do much in the ways of moving the body. Unluckily, the cot was relatively old and one of the cot wheels had to be manually unlocked using hands, as the foot pedal was too rusted to effectively use. AJ told me to unlock it, and so I carefully bent down and unlocked the wheel. Well, AJ got the bright idea to shake the cot violently as some sort of prank, sending the gray liquid over the edge directly onto the top of my head, dripping down under my eye protection and mask. I closed my lips and eyes so the liquid running over them would stay out of my body, and calmly walked to the employee bathroom in a sort of numb state of shock. The funeral homeowners saw my sludgy appearance and sent me home paid for the rest of the day. I would have walked back in there and cold-cocked AJ with every fiber of my being. Oh boy, my time to shine. I worked as a forensic technician, medical examiner's assistant for roughly 2 years. We were cross-trained in both autopsy and decedent removal from death scenes. I wouldn't particularly say anything was creepy per se, but some things were definitely gross and morbid. Going down to the satellite office, their one HQ office in the state capital and a few smaller satellite offices throughout the state. In the south, that was in the woods at 3 a.m. in the middle of a storm that can be categorized as creepy though for sure. However, I'll do my best to synopsize some of the creepiest things I've encountered, in no particular order. The man who used woman's underwear as a toilet paper. This was a strange one. 2 brothers live in a would-be condemned house, both of which are severely intellectually challenged. One, however, more than the other. This was the most repulsive living situation I have ever personally seen. Black mold everywhere, the ceiling caving in, everything covered in crumbling drywall and water damage. Ironically enough, they had no running water. The only clean thing in the house were 2 pallets of baked beans and Coca-Cola. The only thing these people ate were beans, and they only drank Coke, by the pallet. Anyway, we get upstairs into the deceased brother's room to find him lodged between the bed and the wall, not uncommon for someone who dies suddenly in their bed in all honesty. However, what we find all over the floors is horrifying. Not only does the bedroom look like a typical hoarder's place, with newspapers and rank junk piled up beyond your knees. No. What we see is woman's underwear spewed across the floor, each covered in fecal matter. Not only this, there were guns everywhere. Not like nice guns either, like old decrepit rusted out guns. The entire house was filled with them, hundreds of unusable guns. The ATF had to come clear the scene and document them all. It was insanity. The autopsy, however, was completely unremarkable. The man whose face was infested with wasps. This one was fairly unremarkable overall, with the exception of the fact his face had been eaten off by a wild animal overnight. This poor soul was riding his bike through a field of cranberry bogs, and suddenly died. By the morning, his face was eaten off by a wild animal. He looked like the Terminator. Some musculature remained, as did one of his eyes, but his lips, cheeks, and soft bits were eaten. Upon my arrival, a small swarm of yellow jackets had taken kindly to the man's face and were eating and laying eggs in it. We had to bug bomb the body bag before opening it to make sure the wasps didn't get into the morgue. Decapitation via high-tension wire. A man jumped from a bridge after tethering a length of high-tension wire to it and his neck as a noose. The force ripped his head clean off. That was the first and only decapitation I actually saw on the job. Woman odds tilde 8 months pregnant. Not much to say here other than the autopsy was insane. The ME was able to remove the amniotic sac without breaking it in situ. So we got to see the baby through the paper-thin sac. Extremely sad and heartbreaking, but contextually interesting. I might post some more later. Alternatively, feel free to peruse through my post history as I've told a few stories in the past as well in a similar thread. Edit. A word. Edit 2. More stories. Man commits suicide via OD of an experimental drug in dental school. This was one of the most exciting scenes I ever went to do. It A, being classified as a top-tier hazmat situation, and B, the emergency response presence at the dental school. In the middle of the major city for the state in which I worked, a dental student decided to commit suicide by overdosing on an experimental drug. When my partner and I arrived on scene, it was chaos. Police, EMS, fire, hazmat, the news, everyone was there. We had to suit up in hazmat suits to go inside the school and reclaim the body, then get brushed down by the fire hazmat team and then clean the body in an airlocked pop-up tent too. The creepy part being that nobody actually knew what drug or cocktail of drugs the guy used, nor what other effects it might have, so we had to treat it as if it was an anthrax infection or something crazy. Man castrates himself and swallows it. Please reference this post. Link. Man dies via exsanguination due to sodomy with various objects, including a guitar. Please reference this post. Link. I delivered pizza to a crematorium. Dude set down his pizza on a cardboard coffin to get money and I couldn't stop looking at the box on the conveyor leading into the crematorium chamber. I pointed out, "Isn't that a little disrespectful?" The dude came back and simply said, "Oh, don't worry about him, he won't mind." I work as a motor vehicle collision analyst. We get called to fatal vehicle collisions and reconstruct what happened, caused the collision, provide analysis and provide courts with expert testimony. I've seen a lot of deceased persons and animals. I've seen almost every wretched way a human can die in a collision. However, there is one that stays with me every fall. Late October I get called out to a fatal single vehicle incident. The driver was traveling through a shallow S-curve but going too fast. She was not able to negotiate the first turn and her vehicle enters into critical velocity. The wheels buckle on the passenger side and she rolls. She was not wearing her seatbelt and through the first roll was partially ejected out the driver's side window. Her skull was crushed between the outside of the door and the road, and continued to flop, partially ejected as the vehicle rolled. The skull was split from her left eye to the right rear behind her ear. This caused her brain matter to be strewn about the road and car. Her body was eventually thrown from the vehicle and came to rest on the side of the road. One aspect of the job requires an inspection of the bodies to look for evidence. I approach the body, that is facing upright on her back. The skull was very open and I could clearly see the inside cavity of the skull with no brain. The brain was deposited in chunks on the road and has a distinct smell. This scene didn't bother me at the time. I was more fascinated than anything at the time. A few hours later I get a call from my wife, just asking how the days is going. I told her I was on scene and couldn't talk too long. She then asks if I will be working late tonight or be home on time because tonight we were going to be carving pumpkins with the kids. Years later I still can't carve pumpkins and kids have no idea why. I used to be a med lab tech, 68K, in the Army and sometimes assist with autopsies in the hospital. We did one on an infantryman, Fort Carson, 4th ID. That was a suicide by gunshot to the right temple. The round passed under his frontal lobe and just behind his eyes, so it barely skimmed his brain. The pathologist estimated that it took several minutes for him to die just because the location merely made him bleed out and wasn't instant. The creepy thing was, because the round passed just behind his eyes and wasn't hollow point or anything that spread out, it snipped the back of his eyes, causing them to drain, so his eyes were kind of deflated looking, on top of being very glossy, as a dead person's eyes are. It was weird and sad. I was deployed to Afghanistan in 2010–2011 with 10th Mountain Div. My unit was at Kandahar Airfield and I was attached to a 4ID unit at Camp Nathan Smith. That's why your post jogged my memory. In 2010–11 there was a large Taliban offensive. This usually entailed small arms fire and rocket attacks. No big deal. In general, the Taliban would not attack a large FOB, for obvious reasons, and instead rely on indirect attacks like rockets or mortars. Sometimes, however, there would be an organized attack using suicide bombers. After one of these attacks I was sent out with a small team to patrol and assess the fence where an attack had just happened. I try not to think about this too much, but when I rolled up there were body parts everywhere from where the suicide bombers tried to get through the fence and detonated themselves. Body parts everywhere was bad enough. But what really fucked me up was seeing a guy's perfectly degloved face caught in the chain link fence. Imagine a realistic human face mask, including hair and mustache, hanging in a fence. It was exactly that except with a real face. I watched 2 young children's corpses fry with electricity. We responded to an electrocution. A fault caused electricity to be traveling down the stabilizing cables of the electrical pole. A little kid touched that cable and got shocked, causing his hand to grasp tighter. His little buddy must have seen it and grabbed him. By the time we got there they were both dead, but still electrified. We couldn't safely approach until the electricity department cut the power. So we sat there and watched these 2 little bodies twitch and spark. Was like a horror movie. I helped with an autopsy where a woman wasn't found for a few weeks and her cat started chewing on her. To be fair, I'd rather my pets eat me than go hungry. I ain't using it anymore.